Good morning, everyone. We have the die-hard coffee and commerce people here. The donuts are free. Take two, please. Welcome to the April session, and we want to continue trying to get more and more gas and oil information as we go through the next few months, and we know things are kicking back in, so you're going to hear all about that today. I want to thank Southgate Hotel once again for having us, and also for Parnell and Associates for sponsoring the broadcast today. So this will be taped and replayed on local television for the general public to be able to see, so they can get the same information that we're going to hear. Also, Cambridge Packaging provided the pastries for this morning, so thank you to Cambridge Packaging. So without further ado, I want to introduce Jimmy Stewart, who's been here before and spoken to us and continues to come back and enlighten us on all the details of the gas industry. Sure. So Jimmy's from the Ohio Gas Association, and I'm just going to turn everything over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. Good morning, folks. Just wanted to briefly introduce myself. Again, my name is Jimmy Stewart. I'm the president of the Ohio Gas Association, not to be confused with the Ohio Oil and Gas Association. Essentially, the difference being that the Ohio Gas Association, as I'll get into in a little bit with my presentation, our members are not the folks that go out and explore and drill for natural gas and oil. Rather, we're basically the pipeline, the distribution, the utility side of the industry. In other words, we don't drill it, we move it from point A to point B and then send you the bill for it every month. Sort of like Columbia Gas, Dominion East Ohio, formerly Dominion East Ohio, Dominion Energy, Vectren, Duke, those type companies, as well as the large diameter transmission lines that move large volumes of gas all across the United States. It doesn't just magically get, to your hot water tank from the wellhead by magic. So with that said, let me begin my presentation here with that. Again, that's largely who our members are, the large transmission line companies, as well as the distribution companies. When I say distribution companies, I mean local distribution companies. A lot of us have probably heard of the four largest ones in Ohio, but what folks often don't recognize is that, aside from Duke and Vectren, Dominion, and Columbia Gas, there are several smaller distribution companies. Ultimately, all of them are connected in, whether in Ohio or other states, they're all connected in to these large transmission lines that you see crossing the United States that incidentally you drive, perhaps walk over top of every single day. As you can see, there's a large number of these in the southern United States, Texas, Louisiana, out in the Gulf, Mississippi, Oklahoma, the areas where natural gas traditionally in the United States came from, the Gulf, as well as Oklahoma, Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana. Over time, you're going to see some changes. We're already seeing some changes to this map, but ultimately, all of the distribution companies are connected into these large diameter pipes, getting the gas from the source ultimately to your house or your business facility. And think of it as the blood that's going through your body. The artery coming from your heart is larger as it goes through your body all the way down to the capillaries, the smallest, all the way to your fingertips. Same thing is true in this industry. You have Columbia Gas, Duke, Vectren, as well as roughly 30 or so smaller entities that also distribute natural gas, some of which are municipal governments. The city of Lancaster, Ohio, the city of Hamilton, Ohio, and Butler County. You have your city water, your city sewer, and your city natural gas department in those particular cases. Unless you lived in some of these service territories, you would never have heard of a company like the Waterville Gas Company or the Suburban Gas Company or Pike Natural Gas. With all that said, I wanted to get into some information about what is driving the natural gas market here locally, regionally, and nationally, and even to some degree internationally. A lot of these forces are perhaps positive for our local region, some of them not so positive. Give you a little bit of information here about where natural gas is coming from on the production side. Where is it coming from? Of course, traditionally, a lot of it came from the Gulf Coast. What we have seen, though, with the advent of horizontal drilling, though, is areas like Pennsylvania have come on very strong, taking a very large percentage as natural gas production has markedly increased in the last 10 or 12 years. What you're seeing now is states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, even North Dakota are now accounting for a larger share of the production. And actually, the rest of the United States has fallen. Again, this is just specific to shale gas production. Remember, not all natural gas production comes from shale gas. There are a lot of Clinton wells, for example, in this part of Ohio that were drilled decades ago. They're still producing, but they're increasingly a smaller and smaller and smaller share of the market. So within all the shale gas that's being produced, to no one's surprise, you see Pennsylvania, again, in just the last 10 years or so, producing a huge chunk of the shale gas. Increasingly Ohio, the Utica and the Marcellus accounting for that. And then to some degree in Texas with the Permian, which is largely an oil play, but also some natural gas production coming out of there. And then some areas that were initially big producers of natural gas, like the Haynesville Shale, has actually declined as some of the other more efficient, more cost-effective plays have come in and provided a lot more production. One thing I should mention, actually, before I get to this, I don't have a slide for it, but my friends at OOGA do. Ohio is actually the 8th or 9th largest natural gas consuming state. Think of it. We are a big state. We are an industrial state. It gets cold. It stays cold. We use a lot of gas in Ohio. And from probably 1980 until about 6 years ago, in the aggregate, Ohio produced about 10% as much gas as Ohio used. About 10% as much gas as Ohio used in the aggregate. In other words, we produced a very small amount compared to what we used. In the last 5 or 6 years, that 10% has quickly shot up. A couple years ago, we produced as much as we used. Now it's over 50% more than we use. Again, we are still about the 8th or 9th largest consuming state. We went from producing a very small amount to now a very large amount. In other words, we have an enormous glut of natural gas in this part of the country. With that said, this right here has a lot of information, and there's a lot of takeaway in this chart. This is the weekly natural gas rig count. It also contains the average Henry Hub price of natural gas during this time period, going back about 10 or 11 years. The Henry Hub price, by the way, is basically the daily market price for natural gas down in basically Louisiana. And actually that price in recent years is higher than what it is here because of the glut that what we have in natural gas. But with that said, this is interesting. 10 years ago or so, we peaked in terms of nearly 1,600 rigs Drilling for natural gas, 1,600 rigs. The price of natural gas fell, like everything else during the Great Recession. You see the price collapsed. So the number of rigs drilling also went down considerably. Then it kind of came back up, but not for very long. Less than 10 years later, less than 200 rigs in the entire United States drilling for natural gas. Went from 1,600 to less than 200 in less than 10 years. But do I have to remind you? Let's go back. Look at the production. We went from 1,600 rigs to less than 200. But look at the production. Look at the production. Fewer and fewer rigs producing more and more gas. It's kind of like, if you think about it, in the year 1800, about 80% of the population of the United States farmed, was in agriculture. Today it's about 2%. Care to guess when we grew more food? We grow more food today than we've ever grown, with fewer and fewer people engaged in agriculture. It's been the story since the beginning of time. Fewer and fewer people in agriculture grow more and more food. What I'm telling you is fewer and fewer rigs, fewer and fewer wells are producing more and more gas than we've ever seen before. So it's created a glut. It's kind of like the farmer, in a sense, that in the springtime, the price of corn was sky high. So he thinks, well, I'm going to invest in this new tractor and this new farming method. And lo and behold, the weather cooperates, and come harvest time, he has the biggest crop he's ever had. And guess what? So did everybody else. What happened to the price? The price collapsed. So that's what you've seen. The price of natural gas has been extremely cheap. And again, that's the Henry Hub price. It's actually cheaper around here than that. Fewer and fewer wells producing more and more gas. Spot prices, again, Henry Hub price, just over the last couple of years. I wish this actually went further back. I have some other slides that I should add into this presentation. Henry Hub price being under $2. At that time, the price here in this region was even lower than that. It's always lower than that. You saw it spiked up here a couple months ago for a day or two. Anyone you want to guess why? It got cold, really cold. So ultimately, that's the story on the production, on the supply side. We have an enormous glut of natural gas, particularly in this part of the United States. So now we're going to talk a little bit about where is all this gas going? This is an interesting chart, perhaps even almost or more interesting than the one about fewer rigs producing more gas. This is the total energy consumption in the United States. So not just natural gas, not just windmills, everything. Notice what happened. Natural gas actually went up, particularly here in the last 7, 8, 9 years. Coal decreased. Probably no surprise to anyone in this room, because in this part of the United States, the coal industry got hit quite a bit. Petroleum stayed fairly close, went down a little bit. Renewables, still a very small percentage of the mix, but got larger. And nuclear stayed pretty much the same. But the real takeaway, folks, we added 40 million people in this country in that time period. Look at the total energy demand. It stayed the same. If anything, it went down. We added 40 million people, but the demand for energy actually didn't go up. How is that possible? I'll give you just something to think about. I don't know. Was anyone here a For anyone in the room who was around in, say, the 1950s, I'd be just curious, how many televisions did you have in your house? One. How many do you have now? Two. Does anyone have more than two? Anyone have three? Five. Wow. Did anyone have 5 televisions in 1960 or 70? Probably not. Maybe I think Elvis did. But if you think about it, one television today uses, particularly these real thin LED flat screens, they use far less electricity than the old televisions of just even a few years ago. But this is telling. This is really telling. If you think about it, we've added how many million people? 40 million people in the United States, but yet it's because of largely because more energy efficient automobiles replacing less energy efficient automobiles, more energy efficient homes replacing less energy efficient homes, more energy efficient appliances replacing less energy efficient appliances. Has a lot to do with it. Although the flip side of that is, how many people owned one of these 20 years ago? Nobody, because they didn't exist 20 years ago. But now we have so many these electronic devices that most people didn't have just a few years ago, which has added to consumption of at least electricity. Again, consumption of natural gas in the U.S. Where does all this natural gas go? Well, obviously some of it's, a good chunk of it's residential customers. You see there in green. Industrial consumers, that includes the chemical industry among others, very large percentage. Increasingly, electric power. Just like you can make electricity from coal and nuclear, hydro, you can also make it from using natural gas. And as the price of natural gas has fallen, increasingly you're seeing natural gas used to generate electricity. It's also easier to meet certain emissions guidelines too, because it tends to burn cleaner than, say, another large source of electric power, meaning coal. There are some other uses. I will even mention, even though it's quite small, vehicle fuel. I didn't drive it today, but I do actually have an automobile that runs on natural gas and only natural gas. And it's very inexpensive. It's about $2 a gallon, equivalent to gasoline. But that's a very, very small percentage of the consumption of natural gas in the United States, although it is growing. Talk a little bit about global natural gas prices. Although the price in the United States is largely overwhelmingly determined by domestic factors, there is increasingly a global market for natural gas. Going back just a few years, it's not every day you see a chart that shows the United States with such a huge competitive advantage, but that's an enormous competitive advantage compared to most other industrialized nations. That's the price for liquid natural gas in these countries. Many countries don't produce enough natural gas, and they don't have the pipeline infrastructure to bring it in from their neighbors, or they can't bring it from their neighbors, so they have to have it shipped in via LNG. Japan being a good example of that. They don't produce any. They're an island, so you can't have it exactly piped in very easily. So they liquefy it and have it shipped in. This basically shows the same thing. North American prices much lower than that of Europe, and particularly Japan. Some of these prices have actually come down a bit. Part of the reason Japan spiked as high as it did was after the nuclear disaster. They had to switch a lot of their production to natural gas for producing electricity. You mentioned, or I mentioned earlier about the hub price, the Henry Hub price. So this is the Henry Hub, Louisiana. The price of natural gas there is not necessarily the same as the price of natural gas in other parts of the United States. And you notice, though they all are fairly close, there are some that you're seeing considerably higher, namely up in the Northeast. Why is that? Because for whatever reasons, some of the states in the Northeast have become increasingly resistant to building additional natural gas infrastructure to allow natural gas to come from places like Pennsylvania and Ohio to get into their areas. And as a result, when capacity is constrained at times in the winter, for example, when it gets very, very cold and there's a high demand for natural gas, the price skyrockets. So yes, it went up everywhere, but nowhere near as much as what you saw in the Northeast. And then the Dominion South, that is closer to the price that you see in western Pennsylvania and far eastern Ohio, always pretty consistently below what the Henry Hub price is, which if you're a consumer, that's great. If you're someone in the business of drilling and producing natural gas, that's not so good. Again, showing that pretty much the same thing, Henry Hub price versus a couple of the hubs in this part of the country, consistently much lower price for natural gas. Again, if you're a producer, that's not a good thing. If it is, if you're a consumer, it's wonderful. I spoke earlier about one of the primary uses for natural gas is electricity generation, and that's an increasing use actually. Traditionally, when natural gas, prior to 10 years ago, or even less than 10 years ago, natural gas tended to fluctuate in price quite a bit, and it also, in the early 2000s, got quite expensive and was at that time largely used in electricity generation at peak times, meaning at peak demand times like in the summer when there would be a call for it, because much of the time the price of natural gas was so high that you couldn't use it to generate electricity and still make money or make very much money at it. But as the price of natural gas has fallen, we've seen some changes. Probably no part of the country knows this story better than Eastern Ohio and Northern West Virginia. As you've seen, coal as a percentage of the total electricity generation in the United States fall in the last several years to basically even with that of natural gas, which has come up. Nuclear stays fairly constant at around 20%. And then the renewables tend to be a very small percentage. Hydro actually did spike up a bit in the last year or so, largely because in the state of California they had a lot of rain and they have a lot of hydroelectric capacity out there. So that's sort of, how long will that last? It's probably more of a temporary phenomenon. Again, pretty much showing the same thing, that you're seeing the percentage of electricity coming from coal has come down. It seems to be leveling off, and natural gas and coal seem to be neck and neck, depending which forecast you believe over the next 10 or 20 years. Some say coal will make a bit of a comeback, others suggest otherwise, that it will stay fairly flat. I couldn't begin to say who's going to be right on that, but just suffice it to say there are various forecasts from people a lot smarter than me that have differences of opinion there. Once again, electricity generation by source, and showing the same thing, just slightly different time period. Now this brings it home a little bit more. As I keep saying, the price of natural gas is very cheap in this part of the country. So what does that mean? Well, if you're a producer, it generally doesn't mean good things. However, if you're wanting to use it to generate electricity, it makes it very viable to do so. So what we're seeing is a large number of gas-fired power plants on the drawing board here in Ohio. In fact, one very close by. The Oregon Energy Center, I believe, has been completed up near, it's just east of Toledo. Required about a 25-mile long pipeline to pipe the gas into the facility. These are the plants that are actually under construction at this time. As I said, the one up in near Toledo is already completed, but these two are under construction. And just to go back for a second, those were approved and or proposed. So as we all know, it takes a while for these things to actually get underway. I believe there have actually been a total of 11 or 12 proposed for the state of Ohio. They just haven't, they're just not all approved yet. And finally, I wanted to say a little bit about natural gas storage, because even though throughout the year the production of natural gas is fairly stable, but we don't necessarily use it all at equal amounts during the year for obvious reasons. So what happens in the meantime is a lot of the natural gas goes into storage, into underground storage caverns at various parts of the United States that have the geology to be able to safely store natural gas. And these injections into these various storage facilities are monitored, and every week, based on whether that storage is increasing or decreasing, how much in storage is it, whether it's decreasing or increasing, and at what rate, has a lot to do with those hub prices that I was talking about earlier. A lot of these, if you think back to the winters here in just the last few years, it's pretty much self-explanatory. In years like 2016, when we really didn't have much of a winter, what happened? The storage, well, of course it went down. It didn't go down very far. But if you go back to 2014, when we actually did have a bit of a winter, it got down to a much lower level by this time of the year, is usually when you reach the sort of the low water mark. And then as the temperatures warm up in the summer, typically the storage builds up. And actually, I should mention that here a couple years ago, we saw record storage. There's been some discussion as, how much more can is there even available to store natural gas? But again, when the price is very, very low, all things equal, fewer people are drilling and producing natural gas. So to some degree, a lower price lowers production ever so slightly, whereas bad weather, whether it's really hot in the summer or really cold in the winter, also tends to drive the price up because more is used either for heating and or electricity generation in the summer months, which takes away from the storage. So the prices tend to fluctuate with that. This is just pretty much the same thing, but a little bit more recent, showing you, again, a couple years ago, didn't have much of a winter. We had an incredible storage by in the fall. Started to get cold, starts to come down. Actually, we had a bit of an anomaly in February of 2017. I don't know if anyone remembers, it got up in the 70s there for a few days. And as a result, very unusual, but the natural gas supply actually went up in February, which seldom happens. But whereas this year we've had a much colder winter compared to last couple of years, so it went down quite a bit. And it's actually, as I could update this slide, we're just getting to the point where it's starting to level off, and we would expect that the storage build would begin here shortly in the next couple of weeks. Here locally, I'm sure you've heard the talk of some of the large transmission lines that have been proposed. and in the case of Leach Express, been pretty much wrapped up as far as production. Leach Express being one. It was initially a Columbia Gas company, which was then sold off to TransCanada. This one's pretty much wrapped up. The Nexus pipeline, which went through various FERC hearings the last few years, got approval, finally got FERC approval a few months ago and is now underway. And then finally, the Rover pipeline, which is two twin 42-inch diameter lines. What you see all of these have in common is they're taking the gas from the area where it's produced, where there's an enormous glut, and getting it to other hubs in other parts of the region. So, with that said, I just wanted to thank you all for coming out today. I can attempt to answer some questions if you have any. Again, this is sort of a big picture overhead view of the market, what is driving production. And I just again have to reiterate that so much of this is driven by an industry that to a large degree has been a victim of its own success, in that fewer and fewer wells are producing more and more gas. The supply continues to go up, and ultimately in certain parts of the United States, particularly here, we have such a glut that the price is actually the lowest of anywhere in the United States. So it presents a lot of challenges for the production side, but also a lot of opportunities for folks who are using natural gas in large volumes. So with that said, thank you for having me. If anyone has any questions, comments, or wants to tell me to go to hell, this is your chance.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
I appreciate it.
Certainly.
May 3rd is the next meeting. However, we're not going to be able to be here because they've got the facility in use by someone else. So I'm either going to change the date or the location, so stay tuned. It's going to be on tax reform next month. Now, I want you to mark your calendar for June 7th because we're going to have David Hill and hopefully Jerry James come and talk about the recent study that was commissioned. I sent it out to all of you a couple weeks ago. I recommend you get on shalecrescentusa.com and look at the overview of that study. It's a long report, so you probably aren't going to want to read through everything, so you just want to come on June 7th and hear it live. But this study really, in my mind, what I want to tell everyone, and the reason you want to find it important, or you will find it important, is that it proves that our area in southeast Ohio, the Shale Crescent, which is southwestern Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and southeastern Ohio, the Shale Crescent, is 4 times more profitable for petrochemical companies to come and locate here near the source of our energy. So you'll want to come to June 7th. You'll want to go to Shale Crescent USA and look at that report. So that's June 7th. There was something else I was just going to say, and it went right back. Oh, I was going to say, Norm has some great underground storage facilities that he would love to be able to store some of this gas. With all of our challenges in our area with underground mines and that type of thing, we keep thinking we could store that energy down there. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Thanks again to Parnell and Associates for sponsoring the broadcast today. We really appreciate that. And we will know about the May meeting. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, so Jerry James, who's going to be presenting in June,
Hopefully.
actually, the Shale Crescent, the whole concept, for those of you who aren't aware, the Shale Crescent actually gets at this problem of this glut of natural gas and these low prices that we have in this region. It's basically coming up with a demand for that natural gas, and it would be largely in this region.
I think it's just phenomenal news that everybody will want to learn more about it. So thank you very much. And if you have any other topics that you want to see us bring to some of these meetings, please let me know. And thanks again, Jimmy.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.